I recognise a lot of faces here, some more than others, and just to briefly say that my background is that for 10 years I chaired the Appraisals Committee for NICE, which was, and I still bear the scars, by the way, my presentation, therefore, is very much of a personal presentation, but also very NICE-centric. But that doesn't mean to say that it doesn't apply pan-European, if not internationally, as you will have come to appreciate. The first question I pose, and I'll return to this right at the end, is there an HTA regulatory divide? We're not different people, we have different perspectives, and whether that perspective causes a divide or whether it should be parallel and competent development together. So on the regulatory perspective, as you're aware, of course, efficacy and safety, and on the HTA perspective, clinical effectiveness and cost effectiveness, very bland statements. But it is obvious to all of you that the same evidence, not infrequently, if not actually very frequently, leads to quite different decisions, and particularly from the payer perspective, which is obviously very frustrating for those who develop drugs and try to market them. Now, in my view, this is once again very NICE-centric, but I think it does reflect an international feel for HTA as it is now and in for the future. There are three core principles. The first core principle is obtaining value for money in delivery of health care. That's the payer perspective, and that's certainly the outcome that is required for the HTA management of new developments. Working within a defined budget. Now, this is a very contentious issue. It's certainly true for the central government in the UK. It may be also true for many of the central governments and healthcare providers in Europe, and maybe less so in the USA, but becoming more so, whether this is central government or a private payer. The value for money and working within a defined budget is quite clear, and very much the same as any other development within normal life. Finally, in the core principles, is taking account of opportunity costs. And in other words, within a defined budget and obtaining value for money, there will be things which will be displaced. And the HTA environment is to consider that very clearly and very precisely. If we agree a new drug or a new technology which costs a considerable amount of money for the healthcare provider, they will have to decide within a defined budget what they're going to let go. And that might be several dozen diabetes healthcare visitors or new nurses and so on. And you're very well aware of those stresses and strains that are in the payer perspective. Now, from NICE's point of view, and I think this is becoming more so across international boundaries with HTA, on clinical effectiveness and cost effectiveness, there's some clear guidelines. But also there are lots of other issues which play upon the final judgment of the payer. And you'll recognize most of these. Innovation, end of life, a source of considerable concern and worry for those who developed it at NICE, including myself. Extent of uncertainty, the fact that there is quite a lot of gaps in the evidence which require careful monitoring, development and modeling to try and reduce the degree of uncertainty for those who make decisions on paying. Equality and diversity to make sure that there's fairness across the board, and other social value judgments which I won't go into a great deal, but I'm sure you're aware of. And once again, the bottom line here is that patients, clinical experts have consultation comments. And I mention patients because of my colleague Jan, his presentation before, and I want to develop that theme to a certain extent here. The evidence for HTA, and this is a kind of busy slide, and I'm sorry for that, but it contains a whole list of possibilities here, and I just want to highlight one or two of these, and then give you some practical examples of the things that made my hair grey over the 10 years that I was working with NICE. First of all, clinical effectiveness. This is quite straightforward, or is it? Comparators. Comparative efficacy and effectiveness is very important for the payer and becoming very much more important in the development of regulatory approaches to new drugs. Placebo is less and less likely to be the comparator of choice for many reasons. Standard of care is what matters. And this may vary from country to country, but as far as we are concerned in the UK, and as far as NICE is concerned, the standard of care is what we do now in the NHS. What will this drug or this new intervention change with the standard of care as it currently is? And the final point on that I just wanted to raise for you is licensing status. Quite frequently there's a lot of disagreement about whether or not the comparator should only be a licensed preparation. Now frequently in many branches of medicine, of course, they're not licensed. Pediatrics is a great big black hole in many areas. But there are lots of other issues in which standard of care is a pathway of care, which includes unlicensed medications. And the payers, at least in the HTA environment in the UK, have to consider these unlicensed medications as part of their development of their evidence base. Outcomes. Well, of course, as you know, in cost effectiveness, survival is paramount. Whether you live or die, and that's quite easy to measure, at least it seems to be quite easy to measure. Quality of life is the other important rider here, and I just point out that it's both patients and carers, and there are many good examples where carers' quality of life has to be taken into account when developing an HTA precisely. Relevance to patients, I mentioned that later. Surrogates, the important surrogates are not, therefore, end of life or survival. For example, cholesterol levels may well be a good surrogate for new developments in lowering cholesterol, but there are many patients, many areas where surrogates need to be developed in order to avoid the evidence gap. And finally, long-term lifetime benefits. Quite often clinical trials are very short. They do not give you the outcomes for long-term, and therefore modeling is important in that area. Cost effectiveness, the full effectiveness of the care pathway of care is important, not just the cost of the drug. Its delivery process, the need for new technologies and so on. Patient access schemes, well, I won't go into that in great detail, and also relevance to jurisdictions. They do vary internationally. So all evidence is important as far as HTA is concerned. And I'll just give you a list here. And it's not just RCTs, observational studies, registries, case series, clinical opinion, real-life experience, and patient-reported outcomes, all of which are taken into account in a Bayesian approach to understanding HTA, and they are weighted accordingly. So I want to give you a few examples, if I can, here. And the first example is a very simple one, and that's the disease psoriasis and the use of anti-TNFs in the impact of psoriasis on quality of life. Now, the clinical trials at the time really related to only the extent and if you like, the severity of the psoriasis as much as it covered the body. So the greater the percentage of coverage of the body, the more severe was the disease. But in fact, actually, this was a proxy for quality of life, and the patients very clearly pointed out to us that this was not sufficient. In fact, of course, it's actually very important where the psoriasis is. The location is paramount in the disease as far as patients are concerned. And of course, if you've only got 10% of your body covered by psoriasis, but it's all on your face and your perineum and your hands, that is a bad news for you. Whereas if it's on your back, it's not quite so important unless you go swimming. So this issue was very important, and patients' input to this, and their reported outcomes was very important in this disease. So the appraisal committee understood quite clearly the effects of psoriasis on patients' quality of life is a combination of the PASI score and also involvement of body of various sites, and included a disease-specific measure of quality of life. Beta interferon for multiple sclerosis, many of you remember these appraisals. I certainly do. It was 2 years of my life, and very painful it was at the time. The appraisal lasted 2 years. There were 2 appeals, and the important issues here was patient-reported outcomes. Quite interestingly, that in fact most of the trials dealt with flares and remissions, but actually didn't measure disability long-term because it's a long-term disease. And also the patients reported to us that cognition was a very important outcome measure, which was not measured in the clinical trials and had to be taken into account retrospectively and not part of the trials. And if we had actually had a dialogue with developers, we might well have actually considered this earlier on in the development of the drug. Cost-effectiveness modeling was difficult because of the required to extrapolate trial data into the longer-term effects on disability. And I'll very quickly go through this. This is how the whole issue was developed. The disability index was used, and time was on the horizontal axis. The natural history of the regression is observed over 25 years, and the end of analysis was 20 years. The RCTs only stopped at 2 years. The 5-year trial data, that was extension of trials, was only for 5 years. And in fact, 12-year clinical data was available, but only piecemeal. And this produced an extrapolation, at least as far as one of the models was concerned, into a treated progression as estimated. Actually, the treatment stopped on most people at nearly 10 years, and therefore a modeled rate of progression following cessation of treatment was as shown by the dotted line there. But in fact, one could take a different view and actually from a 10-year truncated model, and that disability would be the same or maybe even worse at the end of 20 years than it was, irrespective of the treatment. And of course, as you can see, as you model any of these 3, you get very, very different cost per qualis and cost effectiveness data. Another one which was hit the headlines, I put these up because I find them amusing, but for no other reason. They were very difficult at the time, and that is for the use of Lucentis, ranibizumab, as a VEGF inhibitor in age-related macular degeneration. In this case, quality of life was very important, but one could take a view that if you were only blind in one eye, it didn't matter. So we had to discuss with patients about monocular versus binocular vision. Cost effectiveness was taken into account on that basis, costs of blindness, societal benefits, and eventually a patient access scheme was agreed. The important issue here was that evidence suggested that loss of sight in one eye impacts in a limited way on quality of life, but the patients clearly identified and proved that actually loss of binocular vision was very important, partly because of the fear of the fact that the next eye was going to be affected and therefore they should have their first eye treated. So very important for us. Once again, that was not brought forward in the original data evaluation as far as HTA is concerned, and certainly not in the development of the drug. Next is innovation, and this is a fascinating example of inhaled insulin, a wonderful, innovative idea to get rid of having to inject yourself with insulin. Once again, here, these were the considerations that were taken into account, and they were made great play of during the presentation of the data for HTA, but not as part of a very clear clinical trial program early on. Innovation, this is a new idea. Dosing variation was very difficult. This was very limited with the application of this particular methodology. Costs and benefits. Important was needle phobia. Now, needle phobia is an interesting one because patients said they didn't like to inject themselves and they assumed that by inhaling insulin they would never have to use a needle. But of course, you have to check your blood sugar 4 or 5 times a day anyway, and you have long-acting insulin morning and night. So it wasn't a big issue. Patient choice, they liked the idea, and particularly for convenience and portability. Excuse me for the next slide, the next part of this slide, but actually it was an advertising for this particular inhaled insulin product. And if you think this is convenient and portable, I'd like to see why. So nice technology appraisal recommendations appear to be quite strict, but they require a substantial input of data which has not been developed early on in the development of the drug. And they're out of 291 appraisals published in June 2013, as you can see, NICE has said yes to most of them. Optimized, meaning sort of suboptimal usage within the license indication, but less than the full license, and only research, and no, very little. So actually, HTA in the UK likes to say yes, and that's absolutely certain. So to return to my first slide and the principle of is there a regulatory divide, or an HTA regulatory divide? And that's the first, the position is we would like to consider it, but actually it's not true. And actually it's not a divide, and as has been pointed out also by the first speaker, it's a continuum of evidence development from when the first laboratory investigations are undertaken to delivery of care to patients in the healthcare systems. And so in my view, and I think this is what the purpose of this discussions are today, parallel advice on evidence development at an earliest stage possible should reduce the likelihood of different decisions and provide a better pathway for laboratory to market of new medicines. As well as, in my view, the important issue here is provision of value for money in healthcare delivery, which everybody thinks is important. Thank you for your attention.